Now, I want to start off by, last week I kind of gave you a teaser and told you that we were going to, first of all, explain to you that Betsy Ross did not create the first American flag. And if you could put the first slide up on the screen, this is a painting that was done in the 1890s depicting George Washington and others visiting with Betsy Ross, and she's got that flag that she's sewing together. The problem is that actually there was never any mention of Betsy Ross creating that flag until her great-grandson shared the story in about 1880 or so. So more than 100 years after the fact was the first time that the story was ever talked about. And immediately, it was just such a great story that immediately everybody decided that they wanted to believe it. We put it into history books. Within a couple of years after him telling that story, it was in all the history books, and that painting became famous and so on down the line. But there's no evidence there. What Betsy Ross more than likely contributed to the American flag is actually the stars. Because the original design for the flag called for 6-pointed stars. And you notice that the flag is a 5-pointed star. That's actually a trick that Betsy Ross shared with the creators of the flag. That was one of her biggest contributions, was that making a 6-pointed star took a lot of extra work. And so Betsy's little trick where she could snip a couple of quick snips with the scissors and boom, have a 5-pointed star. And it's very quick and easy to do, and the stars came out kind of uniform. So that was her biggest contribution. The real evidence of who created the first flag kind of points to a guy who did a lot of the work on artwork for currency at the time and the seal of the United States. And there's a lot of proof that indicates that he was probably the one who actually did the design for the flag. What we commemorate on Flag Day is Congress saying, here's what the flag should look like. And they did that on June 14th, 1777. Their flag their flag description wasn't really detailed. So the flags still varied quite a bit in those early days. If you can put up the next slide, this is what we all think of as the early American flag. 13 stars and the alternating red and white stripes. There are 13 stripes to indicate the original colonies, and the stars indicating the states. And then, of course, that flag has been revised. They rewrite that flag code every time that a new state was admitted to the Union. They would rewrite the flag code to add on more stars into the flag's design. This flag design that you saw there wasn't actually the first choice of George Washington. Washington had a different flag that he really wanted for the U.S. flag. If you could put up the next slide, this is what George Washington wanted for the flag. Had the British Union Jack in the corner of it, and that's what Washington liked. When the first day that Washington took the job as general, as commander of the Continental Army, he took a flag just like that one, and he went to the highest point in Boston because the Continental Army was fighting the British in Boston. They went to the highest point in Boston and then got a 70-foot tall pole and raised that flag on a 70-foot tall pole from the highest point in Boston. And you could hear the Continental Army guys all just kind of letting out hollers around town because that flag was visible from pretty much everywhere in Boston because of the height. But then eventually we wound up with the flag design that we see today for Flag Day. And the flag wasn't really common to see like in people's homes and stuff. That really wasn't an issue for people. We didn't have that sense of patriotic pride in America early on to be flying the flag in your home and that sort of thing. That actually happened during the Civil War. And all of a sudden, during the Civil War, flag manufacturers couldn't keep up with demand because people were wanting to fly the American flag during that particular war. After the war was over with, then people started getting the idea about getting bigger and bigger and bigger flags. And if you put these the next slide up, the one on the right there is hanging on the outside of a building. The one on the left is on the inside of a building. That building, by the way, was the pension office where they wrote all of the pension checks for the soldiers that served in the Civil War. And this was a 7-story building. It was huge. They're in Washington, D.C. And that flag was actually paid for by employees that worked in the pension building, because the building was being visited by those aging Civil War veterans, and they wanted to pay tribute to them with that gigantic flag. So that's how they let the soldiers kind of feel special. Then we got into kind of commercializing the flag after the turn of the century. Several other big flags were made. They'd carry them in parades, and the old Marshall Field store in downtown Chicago had this huge flag that they'd hang on all of the patriotic holidays in their store. But the granddaddy of all flags turned out to be a flag that hung on the outside of Hudson's department store if you were in Detroit, and there it is, covering several stories of the department store. And every patriotic holiday, they'd hang that gigantic flag. There are pictures of like Dwight Eisenhower in front of that flag, and other politicians, and big occasions. The Hudson flag would come out. In this flag they flew this gigantic flag. It was replaced once during a 50-year time period. But for 50 years, every patriotic holiday, Hudson had this flag on the side of the building. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that they also had the flag travel to Washington, D.C., and displayed it on the side of the United States Capitol. That gives you a pretty good idea of how big that rascal is. It's huge. So these big-hearted patriots from Detroit were really sharing their sense of pride in this country. They retired that flag finally in 1976. That year, though, 1976, what's the significance of that? The U.S. bicentennial, yes. So there was a former advertising executive up in New England who he had an idea to build a huge flag, one even bigger than the Hudson flag, to hang on the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, so that on the 4th of July, during that 4th of July celebration, remember that year they had the big sailing ships coming into New York Harbor and everything. So those sailing ships have to cross underneath the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, and he convinced the Bicentennial Committee that they should hang this huge flag on that bridge. And what a great picture that is for all of those people entering New York Harbor coming underneath the bridge. So if you want to put the next picture up, they got the flag made. It cost $10,000. A sail company in New England made the flag for them. This was taken on June 28th of 1976. They test flew the flag because nobody knew how to get it up onto the bridge, so they had to try it out once, right? So they test flew the flag on June 28th. And as the day wore on, the winds picked up and it pressed that flag that, it was made out of sail material. Oops. And the flag pressed up against the suspender ropes on the bridge, and the friction was so heavy that they couldn't lower the flag. They couldn't get it to budge. And that flag wound up, then finally the fabric started to give way and started to tear, and there were these huge pieces of red, white, and blue fabric blowing all over the roadway. They had to close the upper deck of the Verrazano Narrows Bridge that day because of that flag being torn to pieces and the material all over the roadway. So The guy who created that flag, though, then dedicated himself for the next 4 years to coming up with a flag that could withstand whatever would be dished out on that bridge, and he even had a plan for motorized mechanism to raise and lower the flag so it could stay on the bridge. And on patriotic holidays, they'd just be able to fire the motors up and raise the flag up. So he worked with textile experts and engineers and so on down the line, and they came up with a fabric that would allow more airflow. It's the material that they make lawnmower grass catchers out of. He decided to create a flag that was going to be 410 feet long and 211 feet tall. Covers 2 acres. And guess where it was made? Yes, here in Evansville. You did? Awesome. There was a change in atmosphere at Anchor Industries during that time. It took them about 6 weeks to put that flag together in early 1980. This is actually a picture inside of Anchor when they were working on the flag with the stars there and everything. Charlotte Austin was the person taking the lead on this project there at Anchor, and they only had, I think, one machine that was capable of doing the sewing on that, and it would require 2 people pulling the fabric through the sewing machine as they sewed the flag together. They finished that flag in March 1980. Go ahead and put the next slide up. And they brought it out to the Evansville airport. They put out 2 acres of ground cover at the airport, and this is them inspecting the flag there. That day when that flag was rolled out, they did a little ceremony at the airport. 10,000 people came out to the Evansville airport to see that flag that day. Pretty amazing. The flag then traveled to Washington, D.C. The next slide. This is Flag Day 1980. This was the actual dedication of the flag. And they dedicated it to the Iranian hostages. You remember those hostages spent about 400 days in captivity, and so this was right in the midst of that. So they dedicated it there at the base of the monument. Never raised the money for the steel and the mechanism to raise and lower the flag. Len never could raise that money. Len Silverfine was the creator of the flag. So the flag traveled around for a few displays. It was laid out at the airport when the hostages were released and they flew back into the United States. That flag was laid out at the airport so that when their plane came in, they did a special flyby of the flag. So that was what greeted the hostages coming back from Iran. The flag then wound up kind of becoming difficult to work with because it weighed 7 tons. So it's a little bit of a burden to put that thing out for display. Len wound up giving it to the federal government. They put it in warehouses. It kind of got lost in the warehousing system. I was part of a group that got the flag back out for display on Flag Day 1991 as kind of a recognition of the end of the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, the one that lasted about 25 minutes, you might recall. It was quick. Boom. We started talking about putting the flag out as a morale booster for the troops, and before we could even say the word morale booster, they were done. So so instead we wound up on Flag Day doing it. But to give you the rest of the story on it, it got passed around a couple of times, and finally a guy was sitting at home in Pennsylvania on July 4th of 2001. His wife will never leave him alone ever again because they were auctioning off that flag on the History Channel, on national television. They're doing an auction for the flag. And he decided to start bidding. And he spent $12,500 to buy that flag. He gets the flag shipped out to his home in Pennsylvania in the summer of 2011. with no idea what that flag's purpose was going to be. Turns out that he was living about 30 miles from where Flight 93 crashed in Pennsylvania. And the true purpose of his $12,000 purchase was revealed. So that flag made here in Evansville that had been just kind of bounced around and seen as something almost useless at one point was then used to help raise funds for the victims of that plane crash and to raise the morale and boost the spirits of the people who were working at that crash site. It rained through the time of the display when they had the flag out, so the flag was soaking wet, and people started wondering how they were going to dry it. And for the second time in its existence, helicopters were used to dry that flag. And they hovered jet helicopters over the top of the flag to draw the moisture out of the flag, and it worked. And then loaded it up. So that's the story of Evansville's Great American Flag. Figured that you would want to know more about that. That flag, our flag in America is one of the places that we turn to in those times of crisis. It's one of those things that we rally around. There are those moments in history, at Fort McHenry when the flag was flown that Francis Scott Key wrote about in our national anthem, in the Star-Spangled Banner. That was a turning point for our country. If you put the next slide up, here's another one of the kind of turning points for America during World War II at Iwo Jima. These guys raising that American flag. If you can imagine, after the hard fighting that was taking place on that little island in the Pacific, what this did for the morale of those troops who had been fighting there. For the guys who lost a loved one, somebody that they cared about in their unit, some of them lost all of their buddies. For them to see that flag go up, it made such a huge difference. Now I'm going to show you another picture of the flag, next slide, making a difference in the spirit and the morale of an entire country. 9/11. Remember that? Yeah. What a moment that was. I mean, as a country, we grieved so heavily. We were obsessed with the news reports and the count of the human cost of that horrible day. And there those firefighters were putting that flag up. And for a while after 9/11, it became a big deal to fly the flag. We had a sense of national unity and of national pride. We had a sense of brotherhood. But there's another symbol in addition to the flag that we turn to on that day. And it's the symbol that we really turn to whenever we find ourselves in those times of really horrible acts. Next slide. Cross. And for a while after 9/11, marquees at schools had references to God and prayer. Everywhere you went, people were displaying both the flag and the cross. This is where we turn. This is the place. But unfortunately, what winds up happening is we kind of wear down over the course of time. Our resolve, our belief, our faith, our desire to share this with the rest of the world tends to melt down with time. You realize that lawsuits were filed to have that cross removed from the site at Ground Zero. That passage of time causes our thoughts and our hearts to drift away. And you notice that around 9/11, see, the whole thing about all roads lead to God melted down. As a nation, I won't say everyone, but as a nation as a whole, that political correctness that requires that we give equal weight to all faiths went away for a while. And we put the focus on the cross. And you see, when there's a horrible tragedy, like what happened last night in Orlando, it's the focus on the cross. It's there that we find answers. It's fine as a nation to have pride in our country and the flag. But even the freedoms that we experience as a nation, as a country, don't come to us because of a flag. It comes to us because of a cross. Where we turn as a nation, but it's also where we turn as individuals when we're experiencing those life struggles. When things seem insurmountable, it's where we go. It's the place that we find the answers. And it was Jesus who said that there's only one way to the Father, and that's through Him. And I believe that. Lock, stock, and barrel. I believe. And so in those times where, for people who are involved in the world of dealing with cancer patients, and you find out that a family member has cancer, the place that you turn is to the cross. When you find yourself in a situation where, as a couple, you're having to struggle with those health issues, with those fears, with those concerns, there's only one place to be able to turn. It's to the cross. When you're dealing with family struggles, with the difficulty of relationships, when you're dealing with your own health issues or depression or any of that, there's just one place to turn, and that's to the cross. Our story as a nation of kind of embracing the cross and then stepping back away from it for a while and coming back because of a disaster. See, that's human nature all the way through the Old Testament. That's what you see everybody doing, right? Is they get red hot with faith and then they get complacent. And things just kind of roll along. And then the next disaster happens. The next thing takes place that puts our focus back. Moses parts the waters and, oh yeah, okay, I get it, there's a God. And then we go for a few years out in the wilderness, and next thing you know, we're kind of going, well, I don't have to pray today. I don't need that in my life every day. I can compromise. I'll pray on Sundays. It'll be fine. But the truth is, That God wants that relationship with us every single day. It's what He yearns for. It's about relationship. So as we mark this wonderful patriotic holiday, and we understand that the price of our freedom as a country was paid for with the lives of brave men and women who have fought for this country, who were willing to sacrifice their lives so that we would have those freedoms. But we wouldn't have even had that had it not been for the fact that one sacrifice was made. That one sacrifice being Jesus Christ on the cross. So even though I will always on these patriotic days be like, hoorah, wave the flag. And I believe what it said in our scripture about, raising the banner. Yes, raise the banner. But always remember that behind that flag is a cross. And before we wrap up, I want to say a huge thank you to Dee, because Dee makes it possible for us to have the flag flying outside of our church. And I thank you for that. I'm a believer that people who have a real sense of gratitude to this country do remarkable things. The people that I've talked about that are behind the scenes and creating these big flags and everything, they do that out of a sense of gratitude. Lynn Silverfine, the guy who had that giant flag made here in Evansville, Lynn was the son of a Russian immigrant. They escaped from a horrible, oppressive regime in Russia. And it just so happens that the guy who currently owns that flag, the guy in Pennsylvania, who has only displayed it once after 9/11, also the son of a Russian immigrant who fled the oppression that existed in Russia shortly after the turn of the century. And those guys live their lives every single day with that sense of gratitude. And wouldn't it be great if we could all recapture that for ourselves every single day? It starts, though, not with the gratitude for the country, but it starts with the gratitude for Jesus Christ, for His salvation.